Okay, well, I think we'll go ahead and get started now. Welcome and thank you all for joining us for the Secure Act 2.0 presentation. Looking at the registration list, I recognized many of the names of those logged in today. But if we haven't met before, I'm Vanessa McElrath. I'm a wealth advisor and partner in our wealth management group. And today I'm also going to be joined by Pam Raphael and Julie Reinhardt. And many of you know that Pam and Julie are both the jack of all trades with regard to our retirement plan clients. They're our retirement plan advisors, and they work on the compliance and administration of all the retirement plans that we work with. But before we get started today, there are just a couple of housekeeping items that I wanted to point out. So for any of you that are logged in today that are looking for CE or CPE for either a CPA license or a certified financial planner license, we will be providing credit for that. And in order to track that, we will be pushing out 4 polling questions throughout the presentation. And so you'll just want to make sure you answer at least 3 out of the 4 of those in order to obtain credit. And if you don't need the credit, you can simply ignore, or you can just answer those if you'd like. So today, as I mentioned, we're talking about the Secure Act 2.0. So why 2.0? What is that about? And really, it's the continuation of the original Secure Act of 2019 that was passed. And that was pretty landmark legislation, and it changed the way that Americans saved and withdrew money from their retirement accounts. And then following up to that, in the final days of 2022, Congress then passed this massive, 4,000 page plus spending package that included the Secure Act 2.0. And in that act, there were close to 100 different provisions that provided numerous changes to retirement savings and distribution rules. So it was a real doozy. There were a lot of provisions. And on top of that, some of the provisions were required. Some of the provisions are optional. Some of them came into effect immediately after that, and some are going to be phased in over the next several years. So obviously there were many, many questions surrounding that, and that's what really prompted us to put that session together for clients, for friends, centers of influence of the firm, just to provide some additional education and training on that. So today we're going to examine the Secure Act 2.0 and the most important aspects and impacts on individuals, on how they save and plan for retirement. And then secondly, we're going to examine Secure Act 2.0 and how that impacts retirement plans and the key rules and provisions that plan sponsors and administrators should be aware of. And again, there were over 100 different provisions. So I think we'd be here all day, if not the rest of the week, if we went into every single provision in detail. But we specifically sought out the most important, and we're going to target on the most important, most impactful to our clients. And then at the end, we're going to reserve some time for Q&A. So you can submit those questions through the Q&A function at the bottom, that bottom bar of your screen. So you can submit them if we talk about something that you want us to address at the end, or you can submit those questions at the end, and we'll get through them if we have time, and if not, we'll follow up with each person individually. Okay, so first, we'll spend some time talking about Secure 2.0 and the impacts on individuals.
Can we go ahead and do our first poll?
Yeah, let's go ahead and do that. Okay, so probably the most important change to come out of the Secure Act 2.0 is the fact that the RMD age has been pushed back yet again. So the RMD age required minimum distribution age, this is the age when retirees must begin drawing from tax-deferred retirement accounts. And historically, for many, many years, the RMD age would begin at age 70 and a half. And then in 2019, when kind of the first Secure Act was passed, it pushed it and bumped it up to age 72. And now with the passage of Secure Act 2.0, it has been pushed back yet again. So effective January 1, 2023, it's either age 73 or age 75, depending on which year you were born. Okay, so if you were born before 1951, Secure Act 2.0 does nothing to change your RMD age. It will be exactly the same as it was before. However, for anyone that was born in the years 1951 through 1959, you get one more year of tax deferral. And then you will have to start taking these RMDs, these required minimum distributions, in the year you turn 73. And if it's 1960 or later, which is your birth year, it's pushed back to 1975. Okay, so I will note that there was a drafting error in the bill itself. So the actual text says that people born in 1959 should start at 73 and 75. So that was obviously very confusing. But since then, a technical correction has clarified that 1959 birthdays will start RMDs at age 73. So, what are the potential implications? One is that, this age increase, it's going to potentially provide some flexibility to delay retirement distributions and let that investment in tax deferral benefit occur longer. But it's also going to bring some challenges and maybe some additional planning opportunities for some other clients as well, or investors. So as I mentioned, again, one of the probably the best pieces about this legislation is it's going to provide more flexibility. There's potentially 5 more years of tax deferral for some, since the rule pushed the RMD age from 70.5 to 75 for some. The downside, where you just have to be a little bit careful, is that this could potentially create a big tax crunch if no proactive tax planning is done. Because if you think about it, you're squeezing more retirement income into fewer years. And so if you're going to live fewer years while you're taking distributions, that's going to occur if you take distributions at 75 versus 70. But then we also have to compound that with the fact that now non-spouse beneficiaries of a retirement account have to take RMDs within a 10-year window. So if individuals had to start taking distributions at age 70 and their beneficiaries could spread distributions over their life expectancy, that was basically how the rules looked, just 5 years ago. But now owners don't have to start taking those required minimum distributions until later on. And then the resulting beneficiaries have a much shorter window to take those distributions. So, for some, these delayed distributions, it's just going to create a much bigger distribution that's required ultimately at age 75, say. And this could larger distributions could result in higher taxes overall. It could potentially push clients or investors into a higher tax bracket, which could then lead to phasing out of deductions, phasing out of certain credits. So this is a really important kind of piece that we're looking at individually with all of our clients, is to determine is there some other activity or strategy that we need to engage to try to smooth out these distributions. So for example, clients that may experience some years of very low income prior to that RMD age, we may look at either doing Roth conversions or engaging in other activities to help smooth out, fill up those years where one may find themselves in a much lower tax bracket. Okay, so there is some proactive planning, and that's something that we're, again, spending a lot of time with our clients individually to determine what's the best strategy. What do we need to do to minimize any potential big tax crunch that may be encountered later on? I will note that although the RMD age was pushed back, this legislation, it did not change the age at which QCDs can be made. So a QCD is a qualified charitable distribution. And this is allowed beginning at age 70 and a half. So for someone aged 70 and a half, you can do a qualified distribution. And again, this is the ability to take up to $100,000 from an IRA and make a contribution directly to a charity. And so historically that was used to offset an RMD requirement. Now folks who are 70 and a half can still do that. They don't get that offset for an RMD requirement because really that requirement doesn't come into play until age 73 or 70 or 75. However, it could still be an effective way to give to charities. So again, there's just some more thought that needs to be put in behind that decision to make that distribution directly to a charity. Now, with the Secure Act 2.0, there were a lot of Roth-related changes as well. And one big piece of that is that the Secure Act 2.0, it removes the disconnect on the RMD rules between Roth IRAs and qualified Roth accounts. So before and prior to Secure Act 2.0, qualified plan Roth accounts, they were subject to RMDs during the plan participant's lifetime. Now, as with Roth IRAs, RMDs are not required from such accounts until the plan participant dies. So the legislation just tried to put them on a little bit more of a level playing field. And just to recap, what do I mean by a planned Roth account or a designated Roth account? That's just a qualified plan account like a Roth 401k, a Roth 403b, or a Roth 457 plan. And again, so historically, Roth IRAs have not been subject to RMDs. Plan Roths have been. Now they both do not have to be subject to those RMDs. And so historically, it was almost always a more advantageous decision to roll funds out of a plan Roth account to avoid those RMDs and to continue to let that money grow tax-free. That was kind of a no-brainer tax planning rule. But now the decision looks a lot more like the traditional 401k to traditional IRA rollover decision. And now we can be more focused on things like investment options, either in a plan Roth account versus what may be available in a Roth IRA account, fees. So those are going to come into play and be much more important instead of just basing it solely around that RMD decision. There are still some Roth IRA advantages that these types of accounts have relative to a designated Roth account like a Roth 401k. And these are just some additional reasons that could help further justify why a rollover would make sense. And one of those is there are specific rules on how distributions are taken out. So planned Roth distributions are considered pro rata. So as an example to illustrate that, let's say I contributed $10,000 into a Roth 401k over time, and then now that account is worth $30,000. So that means there's $20,000 of earnings. So if I take a distribution, a third is going to be considered contributions and 2/3 is considered earnings. However, if I take money out of a Roth IRA, it is subject to different ordering rules, where if I take $10,000 out, it first comes out as a contribution, which comes out as tax and penalty free at any age for any reason. So for folks who want to have a little bit more flexibility in case they need to access some Roth funds before certain ages when penalties come into play, a Roth IRA could provide a little bit more flexibility with that regard. There's also different rules with how the Roth IRA clock works. So in order for earnings to come out tax-free from a Roth account, you have to be age 59 and a half. And the money would have had to have been in the Roth plan for at least 5 years. So with a Roth IRA, there's just one clock to rule them all, just whenever that first Roth IRA was opened. If it's a plan, all Roth 401ks have their own Roth IRA clock that starts that 5-year time period. So again, just something to be cognizant of, that as another factor that we take into account when helping clients decide if it makes sense to keep funds in a Roth plan or roll it over into a Roth IRA. Another big piece, an important piece of the Secure Act 2.0 is that the penalty for a missed RMD was reduced. So these have always been really hefty. There's really big implications if somebody forgot to take a required minimum distribution for the year. And so it was historically 50%, which again is pretty hefty, and it was reduced to 25% effective 2023. So significantly lower, but a 25% penalty is still really steep. So that's why we take a lot of care and time with our clients to ensure that RMDs are done every year and in a timely manner. Now, there is some additional wiggle room that penalty is further reduced to 10% if it is fixed during a certain time, during a correction window. So generally, either the earliest of when a notice of deficiency is mailed, when the tax is assessed by the IRS, or the last day of the second tax year after the tax is imposed. So again, they're recognizing that sometimes things happen, people may forget, and they're trying to, I think, help people correct those items without such steep penalties. Now, another piece of the Secure Act 2.0 legislation that garnered a lot of buzz is this new ability to make 529 plan to Roth IRA transfers under certain conditions. So that's the big caveat there. So first is the money must be moved directly from the 529 plan to the Roth IRA. So it has to go directly from one account to that Roth. Also, it has to be the same beneficiary. So if you set up a 529 plan for your daughter, let's call her Sally, then if you want to do a transfer to a Roth IRA, it has to be to Sally's Roth IRA, okay? So it has to be like to like. I will note that you can update the beneficiaries on a 529 plan pretty easily, but you just got to make sure you do that first before you make any transfers, again, to ensure it's going from like to like. Now, those are just a few of the stipulations. There's still a long laundry list more. So this ability and flexibility, it sounds great, but there are a lot of additional restrictions that really limit an individual's ability to really use this to any great degree. So again, it doesn't mean there's no benefit to this. It's just much more limited than I think we all initially thought. And some additional kind of stipulations or restrictions is that the beneficiary must have compensation. So again, going back to my example, if I'm trying to do a transfer from Sally's 529 to Sally's Roth IRA, she has to have compensation, earned income. So if she's not working or doesn't have any sort of earnings or compensation, I can't make that transfer. Now, this is something that Congress may ultimately decide to change. I don't necessarily think that they intended for that, but the way that they wrote the law, it does appear that the beneficiary must have comp or earned income. Second is that the most you can move in any 1 year is limited to the IRA contribution limit. That's it. So let's say that you do a rollover, and let's say the limit this year is $6,500 for an IRA contribution. So if I do a direct transfer from a 529, let's say from Sally's 529 to Sally's Roth 529 for $6,500, then Sally cannot make a contribution to her own Roth IRA as well. Okay, that limit is a combined limit for both. And then third, even if you do it multiple years, let's say you do transfers for multiple years, there is a lifetime maximum. So the most you could do for any single beneficiary is $35,000. And then on top of that, there's different time period restrictions. So there's a 15-year waiting period from the time the 529 account was first opened. So if you opened up a 529 account for Sally 10 years ago, I couldn't do a transfer to her Roth IRA. That 529 account would have had to have been open for 15 years. Also, none of the money that I contributed to that 529 plan in the last 5 years is eligible for that direct transfer to the Roth IRA. Okay, so again, there's a lot of time restrictions and other restrictions around there. So if you're thinking about doing one of these transfers, it's really important to contact us, work with a financial planner to make sure that you're adhering to all the different restrictions and stipulations involved. Okay, so another major piece of the Secure Act 2.0 is that there is now a new option for surviving spouse beneficiaries of a retirement account. So historically, surviving spouses have had very unique set of options that no other beneficiaries have. So a surviving spouse has very different options than, let's say, a son or a daughter who inherits an IRA retirement account. Now, the spouse, one option that they have is they could take the decedent's IRA and move it into their own as a spousal rollover. So let's say you have a surviving spouse, her husband dies. If he dies, she could take his IRA, roll it into her own, and just treat it like it was always hers. Surviving spouses have also they've had the ability to set up an inherited IRA, but then there are special rules about when they have to start taking RMDs. And there are some spouse-only options with regard to some of those inherited IRAs. But beginning next year in 2024, we're going to have one more option to consider. And so the Secure Act 2.0 says that a surviving spouse is now able to elect to be treated as the decedent. So basically, they're just stepping into the deceased spouse's shoes. So this is just one other option. And so this is going to allow us to pretend that the surviving spouse is the deceased spouse. And generally, this would probably be advisable or make sense when the surviving spouse is older than the deceased spouse. So if the deceased spouse was younger, I can take distributions now based on their RMD age and potentially get a few more years of tax deferral and delay. So again, just something to think about here. It's also likely to be irrevocable. So once you make an election, you can't go back and say, oh, I didn't mean to do it that way. The IRS, they haven't provided any guidance on how that might be changed. And so until we know what it will take to revoke an election, we should just treat it as it's irrevocable. And so again, there's lots of decisions to consider if as a surviving spouse. So some things that you'll want to think about, are ages of the spouse, the surviving spouse, the deceased spouse. Other factors that come into play are what's the most important desire or goal? Is it to get tax deferral and allow that money to continue to grow tax-free for as long as possible? Or is it the ability to access those funds without incurring penalties? And so these are all factors and decisions that, again, we help clients think through to make sure they're making the right decisions, because now there's the options are increasing and making it a little bit more complex. And so I touched on QCDs earlier. There's one more element of the Secure Act 2.0 that impacted QCDs. And it's now the ability to take $100,000 from your IRA and move it to, well, to recap, QCDs are the ability to take $100,000 from an IRA and move it to a charity as long as you're age 70 and a half. Now, one of the changes to result as a result of Secure Act 2.0 is that beginning in 2023, individuals now have a once in a lifetime ability to take up to $50,000 of, as call it QCD, money from an IRA, and move it directly into a split interest entity like a charitable remainder trust, a charitable remainder annuity trust, a charitable gift annuity. And these are different entities where charity gets some money, but so do I. So that's why there's this ability to make this QCD that doesn't go directly to a charity, but it's going into this entity that is ultimately going to benefit a charity. So the rule says that you can move $50,000, but it's probably a very limited case in which this actually would make a lot of sense. Because if you move $50,000, and let's say you and your spouse decide to do it, that's the only way you can fund that split interest entity is with the 50,000 QCD transfers. But once you have these split interest entities like a charitable remainder trust, there's a lot of time, money, and resources that have to go into setting up one of these entities. And then there's ongoing costs. You have to have annual tax returns done on these entities. You have to, annual compliance. And so it likely doesn't make a whole lot of sense for a $50,000 contribution or at most $100,000 if you and your spouse both do that. So again, just some important kind of key caveats that maybe you've heard about this ability, but in reality, the benefit's much more limited. Okay, so those were some highlights of major impacts for individuals. Next up, we'll talk about Secure Act 2.0 and retirement plans, but probably this is a good stopping point for another polling question as well.
All right, so now we're going to talk about some of the items that Secure 2.0 will affect in retirement plans. We've kind of broken them out to three main themes. There's a big push in increasing coverage for people in our country in retirement plans, both in getting new plans started and getting people more access to those plans, getting more dollars in those plans. There's also a big push for Rothification. Not sure that that's a word, but just to try to get some of those tax dollars back for some of these changes that they're putting in. And then lastly, we're going to talk about some new distribution and savings options. And then there's a few miscellaneous items that we'll hit on as well. So for new plans that are being set up starting in 2023, so if there's anybody on here that either maybe they haven't set up a plan yet, or maybe you're going to be working for somebody in the future that doesn't have a plan, you're going to be involved with setting that up. There's going to be some automatic features that are going to have to be built into plans, whether that's automatic enrollment and possibly automatic escalation, depending on what your automatic enrollment level is. Automatic enrollment is where a person has to actually opt out of being in the plan as opposed to opt into the plan. They've found that most people don't end up opting out, and so that's a good way to get people starting to participate. Automatic escalation is where they're escalating somebody from wherever they start when they get automatically enrolled. So if I get automatically enrolled at 3%, then the next year it might bump me up to 4% and so on and so on. Now, if you start that automatic enrollment rate high enough, you don't have to add in that escalation, as you can see here on the slide. And that's for all new plans starting this year. Haven't put that into effect for existing plans, but who knows? That could come down with the next tax change as well. There's also some new tax credits. There's always been the ability to deduct fees that you pay to your vendors, but they've actually added an above the line tax credit with Secure 1.0, and then they revised it a little bit for 2.0. It mainly affects people that are considered small employers. So those people that have less than 50 employees, you can use it for up to 3 years. It is capped every year at $5,000 a year. And anything that you take, as a credit, of course, you can't also take it as a deduction. And those are available in 2023 as well. There's also an additional credit for putting employer money into the plan. employees a match, you're giving them a profit sharing, a safe harbor contribution, you can get some credit for that above the line tax credit instead of taking a deduction for those items. Again, it's kind of targeted more at that small employer. There is a phase out starting, for people who have more than 50 employees. And if you have more than 100, then you're not going to be able to use this tax credit. It is capped, so you can only get a credit for up to $1,000 that you give an employee. So if you're matching somebody and that match turns out to be $2,000, you can only use that credit for $1,000 of it. And if the person makes, the person you're using that credit for makes over $100,000, then you wouldn't be able to use that either. So as long as your employees make under $100,000, you'll be able to use that credit. It is phased out over the course of 5 years. So you can kind of see how that works at the bottom of this slide. And once you hit year 6, then of course that credit would go away. There are some new plan design options for anybody that might have a simple plan or work with a company that has a simple plan. They've made some cost of living adjustments starting next year. They allowed Roth starting this year. They're allowing some different types of contributions next year, like non-elective profit sharing. There used to be a restriction up until the end of this year where you could start a 401k if you already had a simple in place until the next year. So you'd have to terminate your simple plan 1 year and then move into the 401k space the next year. Now you'll be able to, or starting in 2024, you'll be able to make that change mid-year if you feel like that's a good change for your employees. They also started a new kind of plan, which is in effect next year. It's called a starter 401k plan. And the benefit of that is just to kind of basically get your feet wet. It's only going to allow for deferrals. There's no match, there's no profit sharing, but just to allow your employees to save. It's going to have some lower limits than a regular 401k plan, but it's not going to have any testing. So you wouldn't have to worry about whether you're, highly compensated or your owners are, putting in more than your non-highly compensated or non-owners. And then lastly, which we'll talk a bit more about catch-up contributions in the next section, but they are going to have some increased contribution limits for people who are over 60 up until age 63. For people who are over 50 or 50 and over right now, you have the ability to put in a little bit more from your paycheck into a 401k plan. And with this new contribution, catch-up contribution that they're enacting starting in 2025, you'll have some additional, I think they're calling it super catch-up, perhaps, for people in that age 60 to 63 window. Keeping with our theme of trying to get more people into the plan and get more money into the plan, allowing people to save, they are increasing coverage for part-timers. A lot of plans may require that somebody work for 1,000 hours or work for a year in order for them to be able to participate in the plan. And then people that maybe worked for your company year over year that either never quite hit that hours requirement, or maybe they, come and go. If they're working more than 500 hours in those years, in successive years, you might need to take a look at this. So let's say, under Secure 1.0, there is some coverage that was enacted that starts on 1/1 of next year. And then Secure 2.0 kind of refined that a little bit starting in 1/1/25. So let's say you had an employee and in 2021 and in 2022, and then this year, they worked more than 500 hours, but maybe they didn't hit that 1,000-hour window. So they're not really participating in your plan. Well, starting on 1/1 of 2024, you will have to allow them to defer. You do not have to give them a match. You don't have to give them a profit sharing, but they just have to be allowed to save. So it's just a vehicle or a way for them to save. Now, under Secure 2.0, they've shortened that window. So they've made it for 2 years. So we want to watch out for people this year in 2023 that worked more than 500 hours, but less than 1,000. So maybe they're not going to be eligible. But then in next year, you want to see how much hours that they work, because then you might need to let them in on 1/1/2025 so that they can defer. The other option that they've added in, just again, keeping with this theme of letting more people in the plan, getting more dollars into the plan, trying to increase coverage in our country, is this idea of student loan matching. There's been a big push, and you hear a lot about student loans and student loan debt, and people, were saying that they couldn't afford to save. They couldn't afford to save because they had this massive student loan debt. So that's why they weren't participating in their 401k plan. That's why they're not putting dollars in their 401k plan. Well, there were a few companies, they reached out and got some private letter rulings from the IRS so that they could match those dollars, even though the person wasn't participating in the plan. They were giving them the match as if they were. So let's look at my example here. In my example, I have massive student loan debt. I'm making $500 a month in student loan payments. Vanessa, on the other hand, does not have any student loan debt. She's putting $500 a month into the retirement plan. Assuming our salaries are both the same, both of us would get the same match. Her dollars are going into the retirement plan, both parts, her deferral and her match. My dollars are going towards my student loans, but I'm getting the same match she is inside my retirement plan. This can be added if you make a match in 2024. It's probably not something that you're going to be able to put into your payroll system. It's probably going to have to be calculated outside of payroll, which, if we're your TPA, we could assist with that. Or if you have another TPA that you're working with, they should be able to assist you with that. And if you're not making a match, this really isn't going to be something that is going to be beneficial to your employees, because this wouldn't come into play. But at least you'll have that knowledge, you'll have that terminology should somebody come and ask you those questions. And I think we're going to switch over and start talking about that Rothification and those other issues. But I think Katie wanted to throw in another polling question, if you'd like to do that before Pam starts in.
Okay, so on to Rothification. Again, we're not sure if we made this word up or not, but we're going with it. Starting this year, employees can ask their employer to make their employer contribution as a Roth, so after tax. So participants would be responsible for the taxes, but other than that, we really don't have any guidance. So at this point, we don't have any plans that are doing this, and I'm pretty sure probably nobody in the country does, since we're not sure how to report the taxes or how to actually make it happen. So right now, that's something available, just so you know, but it is not actually being done in practice yet. Catch-up contributions, which Julie explained just a few minutes ago, are those for over 50, so that they can put a little bit more from their paycheck in the plan than those that are under 50. This was originally effective on 1/1/2024, so it had a lot of people scrambling around, but luckily they have decided to push it off until 2026. But basically what's going to happen is if you make over a certain dollar amount in a prior plan year, so 2025, and you're over 50 and want to make catch-up contributions, all catch-up contributions are going to have to be made as Roth. This is a way for the government to collect a little bit more tax dollars. The next slide gives us an example, which I think kind of helps. It makes it a little bit easier to understand, I think. So say I'm over 50, which I am, and I make $145,000 in 2025. In 2026, assuming that the regular deferral maximum is $22,500 and it's $30,000 for those of us that are over 50. My options are to put $22,500 into either pre-tax or Roth. I could put all $30,000 into the plan as a Roth contribution, or I can put $22,500 as pre-tax, and then I would have to do the other $7,500 as Roth. Again, this is for people who make over a certain dollar amount. And when they put the act was done in the end of 2022, that dollar amount was 145. At that time, they told us it was going to be indexed. So we're assuming by the time we hit 2025 that $145,000 number will be increased, and we will be checking all of our clients to see who might be affected by this. The next slide gives an example if you are one of those lucky people that can do the super catch-up. So if I'm age 62, because you have to be between age 60 and 63 for that super catch-up, and I make the $145,000 in 2025, my options, assuming that I still have the 22,500 is the actual maximum for most people, but it's 32,500 if I'm between age 60 and 63. So my options are to put 22,500 in either pre-tax or a Roth account. I can put the whole 32,500 into Roth, or I can put the 22,500 as pre-tax and then do the $10,000 catch up as all Roth. And again, I think I just want to make sure everybody knows that this is only if you make over a certain dollar amount, which we don't know exactly what that is, but we know it's going to be 145,000 or more. The Act also created 4 new distribution types. These are all optional, so a plan does not have to allow for them if they do not want to. It'll be up to each plan sponsor to determine if this is a good fit for their employees. The first one is a federal disaster distribution, which actually has been around. It's just it's been something that Congress, every time there's a disaster, Congress passes a law saying that the disaster area or people who have their principal residence in the disaster area can take some money out of the plan. And this has been going on for a long time, but this just made it permanent. So anytime federal disaster is declared, for each instance, someone can take $22,000 out of the plan. And also it increased the loan maximums. Normally that's $50,000 or 50% of your account balance. If your principal residence is in a federal disaster area, you actually can take up to 100% of your account as a loan and up to $100,000 as opposed to 50. And that can also be paid over 6 years instead of 5 years. They also created what's called an emergency distribution. It's limited to $1,000 or half of the vested account balance, and actually can be repaid into the plan if so desired if it's repaid within 3 years. That's not available until next year. Also, domestic abuse victims are also going to be allowed to take out a distribution. It's limited to $10,000 or half of the vested balance and has to be requested within 1 year of the abuse. Again, that's something that is totally optional and is available next year. The last one is long-term care premiums, and this is only for the account holder, so they could take out premiums that they've made for long-term care and up to a maximum of $2,500 or 10% of their vested balance each year. And that doesn't start until 1/1/2026. And for all of these distributions, for most distributions out of a retirement plan, if you're under age 59 and a half, there is a 10% penalty that's imposed when you file your taxes on any money that you've withdrawn. But for these distributions, the IRS is waiving that penalty. So for federal disasters, the emergency withdrawals, the domestic abuse, terminal illness, we didn't talk about, but terminal illness is just what it sounds. If you take a distribution for that, you do not have to pay a 10% penalty, and for the long-term care premiums. And I may have said this already, but you can repay the plan in 3 years if you want to get your money back in to save for retirement for federal disasters, the emergency withdrawals, domestic abuse, and a qualified birth or adoption distribution. And that was actually made available by Secure 1.0. So we didn't talk about it earlier. Emergency savings is something that, again, we hear a lot about. People not, I get a $400 surprise bill and they can't seem to cover it. So Congress is trying to help them out by having a new type of savings account within the retirement plan. So this is another bucket or a source of money that would go out of a participant's paycheck, but into the plan to give them an emergency savings. It will be after tax money. It's limited to $2,500. Just how much comes out of the paycheck. If they have earnings over that, that's okay. It's only going to be allowed for non-highly paid employees. The plan has to allow monthly withdrawals at least. And if you have a match, the employer match will be made on these dollars just as if they were deferrals coming out of the paycheck. If for some reason somebody leaves the company, they could roll these balances over into a Roth IRA. And vendors will not be able to charge for the first 4 withdrawals made from the account. So they can't charge the participant. So somebody's probably going to have to pay for that, but that isn't quite clear how vendors are going to handle that yet. And again, that is something that is completely optional, and it is available starting 1/1/2024. And then we have just a few miscellaneous changes that we thought were just worth mentioning, even though there's, it's not a whole lot of background or anything. But for terminated participants that leave a balance in the plan, where we can force them out either to cash or to an IRA. And we like to do that every year to keep plans clean. Right now, that maximum balance that they can have is $5,000, and starting in 1/1/2024, that's going to increase to $7,000. The IRS or our Congress told the Department of Labor as part of the Secure 2.0 Act that they want them to create an online database for unclaimed retirement benefits by the end of 2024. A lot of people lose their accounts, or the plans can't find people after they move a few times. So we're trying to get it so that people can get to their money and find it. Starting this year, employers are allowed to provide low value gift cards to incentivize enrollment. That was something that was completely not allowed before, but they changed that. There's an expansion of the Employee Plans Correction Program. Basically, it is a list of mistakes that are made frequently, or just very common: late deferrals, missing somebody's eligibility date, things like that. And so the IRS, instead of us having to go to them and ask for a blessing on a fix of some sort, this allows us to go in, self-correct, make a note to the file, and just follow the steps that IRS tells us how to fix an issue. Family attribution for spouses is going to change. It used to be that if you had children under the age of 21 or had lived in a community property state, even if you didn't have an association with each other's companies, if they, two spouses own 2 separate entities, they were considered a control group. Now, starting in 2024, that will no longer be the case. And starting this year, sole proprietors can actually start a plan, but not decide how much they want to put into that plan until their tax return is due. Used to be, well, and every other plan year, you have to make the declaration of your deferrals prior to the end of the plan year. They don't have to be deposited into the plan, but they have to be declared before the end of the plan year. Now, for the first year of a plan, sole proprietor does not have to do that. And I think that brings us to, do we have a final polling question, Katie, before we look at questions?
We do.
Give it another minute or so here, but also if you're like me, you'll think of a question maybe like tomorrow morning while you're doing, getting your kids ready for school or whatever. So if anybody does have questions that pop up after the fact, feel free to reach out to us, either one of us on the team. We'll make sure we get it addressed and answered. We had one question: any comments about RMDs and the consideration of the tax rate increases in 2026? So yes, this is something that we actively look at on a client by client basis, looking at what their current tax rate is today and what it is projected to be, assuming that the current tax rate sunset at the end of 2025. And so that is a consideration taken, whether we need to do some activity or action to help smooth out some of that income, whether it's taking distributions prior to that required minimum distribution age to fund living needs, or if it's to do Roth conversions, or if there is some charitable intent and charitable contributions already being made, it's possible to do those through QCDs as long as they're age 70 and a half. Another question was, does the $100,000 max on RMD distributions to QCDs have any effect on a max for DAF contributions? And they do not. I will say that you cannot do a QCD to a DAF, so it has to go directly to a qualified charity.
Thank you all. This concludes the webinar. It was recorded and we will have the recording available.